reading this morning is from one of the handouts on the Conversations on Race. We got those who attended got this week. It's a classic essay from 1988 by a woman named Peggy McIntosh called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, in which she attempts to enumerate several elements of white privilege, as she calls it, and I will read you the first 21 of them. They go on for about 50. So this is what your privilege is for being deficient in melanin in your skin, the way we've worked it out in American culture. Yeah, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. 1. 2, I can avoid spending time with people whom I was trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust me. 3, if I should ever need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. 4, I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. 5, I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. 6, I can turn on the television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. 7, when I am told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. 8, I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. 9, if I want to, I can be pretty sure of finding a publisher for this piece on white privilege. 10, I can be pretty sure of having my voice heard in a group in which I'm the only member of my race. 11, I can be casual about whether or not to listen to another person's voice in a group in which she or he is the only member of his or her race. 12, I can go into a music shop and count on finding the music of my race represented, into a supermarket and find the staple foods which fit with my cultural tradition, into a hairdresser's shop and find someone who can cut my hair. 13, whether I use checks, credit card, or cash, I can count on my skin color not to work against the appearance of financial reliability. 14, I can arrange to protect my children most of the time from people who might not like them. 15, I do not have to educate my children to be aware of systemic racism for their own daily physical protection. 16, I can be pretty sure that my children's teachers and employers will tolerate them if they fit schools and workplace norms. My chief worries about them do not concern others' attitudes toward their race. 17, I can talk with my mouth full and not have people put this down to my color. 18, I can swear or dress in secondhand clothes or not answer letters without having people attribute these choices to the bad morals, the poverty, or the illiteracy of my race. 19, I can speak in public to a powerful male group without putting my race on trial. 20, I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. 21, I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. Privilege and responsibility. It has happened again. A few days ago, police in Cincinnati shot and killed a black man who had just been in a traffic accident. The police claimed he was brandishing a BB gun, but they thought it was real. The whole scene was caught on not one, but 2 videos. Only 3 hours earlier, police in the same city were called to a domestic disturbance and confronted a white man who was brandishing a gun, which was in fact fake, but appeared to be real. Although this man resisted arrest, police never considered using firepower, and he was taken into custody without injury to anyone. This is literally a matter of life and death. Many people will explain this difference in result as an example of white privilege. A basic tenet of anti-racism work is that whites are blind to the privilege we have and need to be led to be aware of it. What I want to explore this morning is whether white privilege is a useful concept, and suggest that a better question might be white responsibility for dismantling racism. What is privilege? I don't watch much TV, but I must confess that I'm totally hooked on Downton Abbey. Why is this? Partly it is the skill of the writer and the actors in humanizing all the participants in a profoundly unequal way of life based on hereditary titles and money, as that way of life becomes increasingly irrelevant in the democratic tides of the early 20th century. The line between the members of the great family in the great house and all of the servants who wait on them hand and foot is not ironclad, for one character came into the household downstairs but made it into the family by falling in love and marrying one of the daughters. Yet the stark economic fact is that the Crawleys, for all their good intentions and fussing, do not work for a living, but have a staff of servants to feed them, to run the house, to help them get out of bed in the morning and put them to bed at night. That might be taken as a paradigm of privilege, having a status that is available to some people and not to others. And that fits roughly with the American system of race. In the South, slave-owning families tried to imitate the English social structure depicted in Downton Abbey, and we can see parallels between the erosion of privilege in Downton Abbey in the 20th century and the partial disintegration of Southern white privilege after the Civil War depicted in a film such as Gone with the Wind. The Southern milieu in which I grew up had remnants of this system of privilege. In last week's conversation on race, we were asked to recall some of our earliest encounters with race, and a particular moment of shame and embarrassment popped up in my mind. My family lived in the white post-war suburbs of Columbia, SC, and the only black people we would normally encounter were the maids and gardeners who worked in these suburbs but lived closer downtown. We white kids would ride the public bus downtown to meet our father at his law office, and he would take us to the barbershop for a haircut, or we would go to see a movie. It seemed the most normal thing in the world back in the 1950s that we white boys would ride at the front of the bus, and the black women who were coming off their shifts in domestic work would ride at the back. On this particular day, I must have been about 10 or 12, and I must have had some white friends with me. We must have been joking about something having to do with the local radio stations, because what I remember saying in a mock black accent was, "Oh, I just love listening to WOIC." WOIC, of course, was a black radio station. Right after I said this, I realized that I had said it in a loud enough voice that everyone in the bus would have heard me. I was making fun of black people when there were black people within earshot. I told that story last week and tell it here, not to simply relieve my shame or relive it, but for what it says about the deeper relations which that shame marks. The culture in which I grew up had channels of communication, and you didn't cross them. There was one way to talk when you were among whites, and another way to talk when you were in mixed-race company. I remember the family dinners in the 1950s. Sometimes if there had been a civil rights incident in the news, it would surface during the family dinner and elicit clucks of disapproval from the uncles and aunts. But at these dinners, there was often an African-American maid in the kitchen, and when she would appear to serve food or take plates, the conversation would be suspended until she went back into the kitchen. Such times create and reinforce a sense of white identity and solidarity. Is this privilege? In our conversation on race, one of our handouts last week was a classic essay on white privilege called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh of Wellesley, written in 1988. The gist of her argument is that blacks suffer great disadvantages in multiple ways in contemporary society because of their skin color, and this means that whites have a corresponding advantage, and that advantage amounts to a privilege which is invisible to most whites most of the time. It seems like normal life. I read from a list of the specific white privileges a few minutes ago. Now, it is obvious that this list is derived from black disadvantages. Tandeka, our UU black theologian, criticizes the notion of white privilege on the grounds that it is simply a negative way of talking about black disadvantage, and it is more straightforward to talk about how racism impacts blacks negatively than about how it benefits whites. I'm sympathetic to Tandeka's criticism. She's not denying that racism exists. She is not denying that white is an identity created by racism. She is just saying that privilege is not a useful category. Even Peggy McIntosh, the author, after listing the privileges I just read from, goes on to say, quote, "The word privilege now seems to me misleading. We usually think of privilege as being a favored state, whether earned or conferred by birth or luck. Yet some of the conditions I have described here work systematically to over-empower certain groups. Such privilege simply confers dominance because of one's race or sex," unquote. Now, I have always had an ambivalent relationship to privilege, as I suspect many of us do here in this room. On the one hand, I profess to be a Democrat and believe in the complete equality of all people, not just before the law, but in society generally. And early on in childhood, I became firmly convinced that black people in the South get a raw deal, that the social dominance of whites was unjust. I've held that conviction for more than half a century. But then there's my inner snob. I find myself drawn to all kinds of exclusive social groups. I have degrees from 2 Ivy League universities, both of which I eagerly sought and chose. In both instances, it might have been more practical and less expensive for me to pursue those degrees at other institutions. But among all the factors weighing in these decisions, the prestige of the places certainly counted in my decision. My degrees hang on my office wall, and though they're written in Latin, I think there's some language in them that admits me to all the rights and privileges of the degree. I've never found out what those privileges are. Maybe getting a ticket to football games on alumni weekend. But I did get a good education at those schools, which is the pearl of inestimable price. And a good education is a privilege which many in this society can't afford. Sometimes I think that critical thinking itself is a privilege. I was attracted to Unitarian Universalism as the thinking person's religion, which had commanded the allegiance of the Boston Brahmins in the 19th century. Unlike the Universalists, the Unitarians never founded a college or a university of their own because there was a strong, though unofficial, identification with Harvard. We all partake in this kind of dual thinking. We assume that any social group we join is excellent because it has us as members. But then once we're on the inside, we must maintain that excellence by being careful about who else we would admit to the privilege of membership. Groucho Marx, who was Jewish, famously said at a time when many clubs were closed to Jews that he wouldn't join any club which would admit him as a member. And this really is why churches like ours stay small. I like to list the blessings of which my life is full. That I live in a beautiful place, I'm able to do the work I love and get adequate pay for it, I have family who love me and with whom I get along, I enjoy the support of a great congregation, and I have generally good health. I could list my blessings at greater length, but you get the idea. Are these blessings also privileges? There are many people who do not have just these blessings, but I don't think that fact makes the blessings I enjoy into privileges. And blessings are in the eye of the beholder. If I wanted to look at the glass as half empty, I could complain about how far Cape Cod is from the city, where life is really happening, maybe, or how I'm not making as much money as I did as a lawyer. I can find the underside of these blessings quite readily. I choose to look at the blessings. But we're talking about white privilege. And so we have to ask, is my own skin color involved in these blessings? There are many people who do not enjoy the particular blessings that I have listed. There are millions of reasons why. For the particular path I took had lots of false starts, runs of good luck as well as some bad. But I suspect that is the wrong approach. The question is not whether anyone's skin tones bar them from the particular path my life or any of your lives has taken, but rather bar them from general prosperity, safety, and comfort and justice, from being able to walk the streets without fear of being shot by the public servants who are supposed to keep you safe. If I widen the scope of my vision, the blessings I count, I'll assume a certain level of acceptance in society for me when that acceptance is very much in question for my brothers and sisters of color. Let me try to get at this another way. The word privilege for a lawyer often has a close tie to confidentiality and communications. Privileged communications are those between a lawyer and a client, between a doctor and a patient, between a priest and a confessing layperson, between a president and his counselors. If the communication is privileged, courts and Congress cannot compel it to be disclosed. As I think about the racial code of silence that I spoke about just now, I think there's a sense in which the communication sense of the word privilege is applicable in racism analysis. If there are words or topics which whites only speak to other whites about, this might be considered a white privilege. Is this white-only speech racist then? No, not necessarily. Anti-racism work has evolved techniques which are being practiced in the conversations here in this meeting house of having whites speak to whites about these sensitive subjects. This is because you can only advance in your understanding of the forces within you if you are willing to confront them honestly. And in the presence of blacks, whites tend to say what we think we're supposed to say, maybe rather than what we really feel. I've just seen the plans for the UUA General Assembly this summer in Columbus, and they're planning a large-scale conversation on race, but it's going to take place in 3 parts: among blacks, among other people of color, and among whites. The organizers of the event feel that it's necessary that black participants in particular have confidence that there's a safe space for their conversation. Now, a lot of you may be put off by this. I see some sense in it, although I think ultimately I would like to see us talking to each other across the racial divide rather than along it. But let's get back to privilege in the common sense of a status which excludes certain people. I still think Tandeka's objections have not been answered, that it makes more sense to talk about blacks being disadvantaged by American racism than that whites are advantaged by it. It is clear to me that while race itself does not exist in nature, but exists only in our mind and in our culture, it is firmly entrenched there. And racism continues to plague us after the institution of legally sanctioned slavery, for which it was fashioned, has been dismantled. 2 weeks ago, I discussed racism as America's original sin, and I quoted a famous line in the Arthur Miller play, Incident at Vichy, apropos of the Holocaust. Quote, "It's not your guilt I'm interested in, it's your responsibility." It doesn't help dismantle racism for whites to collapse in guilt. What is needed is a clear view of our responsibility for maintaining this structure of oppression. A lawyer looks at that word responsibility and breaks it down into 2 parts: response and ability. The ability to respond, or more fully, the ability to respond in damages. Damages meaning the money that's paid at the end of the lawsuit if the plaintiff is successful. Not respond in the sense of answering the question, but respond in the sense of righting a wrong. When your car is smashed by the Coca-Cola truck driven by John Smith, your lawyer will look for a responsible party to sue. And while John Smith may be covered by insurance, the lawyer will also add the Coca-Cola company to the suit for extra assurance that whatever amount of damages are awarded will be paid. A lawyer is trained to think of responsibility in individual terms because that's the only way the courts can deal with it. A large part of the day-to-day business of the law courts on the civil side is sorting out who is responsible for particular injuries. As to each party sued, it must be proven that that party legally caused the injury in order for there to be a judgment for damages, that is, money to be paid. So if you sue the Coca-Cola company, they may try to get out of it by claiming that John Smith was actually taking the truck on a personal errand at the time he smashed your car. This kind of legal responsibility is different from moral responsibility. This is a classic hypothetical from my law school days. I can still remember it after 40 years. If you are walking along a pier and someone is in the water drowning, and there's a life ring right beside you on the dock, which you could throw to the drowning person, you may have a moral obligation to throw it, but you do not have a legal one. You could not be successfully sued for ignoring the drowning person unless you had caused them to be in the water in the first place. So, concepts of individual responsibility are where I start from, but they don't get us very far if we're trying to determine what responsibility we have as whites to dismantle the many-faceted structure that is racism in the United States. The racism that makes life difficult for our brothers and sisters of color may be systemic. That may be no less real and no less damaging than overt racial hatred, but it is harder to assign individual responsibility. But one thing that whites do have, which all of us have, are voices. We have the power of using words. One of the great powers of using words is to express what is just and what is unjust in our opinions, what matters and what does not matter. Let's get back to what happened in Cincinnati. I've said before that each police-citizen encounter has a complex matrix of facts, and the fact that one citizen here was white and the other black may be of lesser importance than other factors in comparing the two, but on just the facts that I have stated, this white voice is comfortable in calling strongly for an investigation to be made, a civil rights investigation. Now, it is not our responsibility out here on Cape Cod to investigate, to judge, to determine whether race or some other factor explains this result in Cincinnati. It is our responsibility, it seems to me, to call the justice system to inquire and inquire fairly. In a similar vein, it is not our responsibility what events are or are not racist, that they're not connected to anything we've done particularly. But I submit that it is our responsibility to declare our values. And one of the best declarations of our values, in my opinion, is the statement, Black Lives Matter. It is appropriate to have a majority white congregation make this statement publicly to ally ourselves with our brothers and sisters of color. And that is why I proposed a banner proclaiming this. For all that has been done by Black Lives Matter activists in different cities with which we may disagree, it still seems right for this little UU congregation in a town that is 98% white by the census figures to join with a growing number of UU congregations around the country, not to pronounce judgment, but to declare the quiet conviction, which needs reinforcement from white voices, that as much as this false notion of race divides us arbitrarily on the basis of how much melanin we have in our skin, we're in the most profound reality all one people, connected in a living scheme, that unjustified killings of blacks hurt us all and must stop, and we must find ways to reach out to each other. These words are the life ring we can throw to the drowning person. They are within our power. We may not have the legal responsibility to throw them, but I think our moral responsibility is clear. Pope Francis used his powerful voice this week to declare that a proposal from a presidential candidate to build a wall on the Mexican border was not Christian. We can use our voice as well